Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor Podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
I'm Amy Sandler. Jason Rosoff is out today. And so, Kim, even though you and I were both at Harvard Business School in the mid-1990s, just a year or two ago, it feels like, oh my God, even really just looking at that looks so long ago. But we did not know each other. And what you didn't know at the time was that the year after graduation, I stayed on campus and I was co-writing case studies, Harvard Business School case studies. And these had the really page-turning titles like, quote, Shock Therapy in Eastern Europe, Polish and Czechoslovak Economic Reforms. That is how I spent the year after business school. Were you in the Soviet Union at that time?
I was not. It was Russia at that time, no longer the Soviet Union. And I was there before, right after college, in the years from 1990 to 1994 is when I was in the Soviet Union / Russia.
Just for clarification, when did the name change? When did the official change occur?
1991, I believe.
Okay,
it was like, I remember it happened when I was flying home for the holidays. So it was December of 1991, I think.
Wow, it really is amazing, I think, to get that historical context. I was in Europe during college in the year that the Berlin Wall fell. And so
89, that was
1989. That's right. So this is a long history. Jason is usually our historical context guardian, so we hope we're doing it justice. Things have changed. One thing that stayed the same is the use of case studies as a way to learn. And the former dean of Harvard Business School, Nitin Noria, noted on the 100th anniversary of the case study, that was just a couple of years ago, and I'm going to quote, "Cases teach students to size up business problems quickly while considering the broader organizational, industry, and societal context. Students recall concepts better when they're set in a case, much as people remember words better when used in context. The case method cultivates the capacity for critical analysis, judgment, decision-making, and action." And he went on to share that when asking alumni about their experience with the case method, that what is developed are what's called meta skills. These are long-lasting abilities that allow you to learn new things more quickly. And I'd love, Kim, do you want to paint a picture for our listeners who haven't been part of the case study method? Like, what actually happens in a business school classroom when folks are discussing a case?
So before I'm going to describe it, but before I just want to share I'll never forget this. I think it was our first day at business school. We had a talk about the case method. HBS is very proud of the case method. And one of the deans, I don't remember who said this, but stood up and said very with great certainty, "Adults do not learn through contemplation." And I'm like, oh my gosh, that is a debatable statement. But anyway, so here was
Let me contemplate that for a moment.
I don't think that's true. I'm going to contemplate. Are you saying the only way we can learn is by sticking our hand in the fire? We can no longer be warned. But I will say, so I'm not sure that it's all it's cracked up to be, but I did like the case method. You would walk into this classroom and there were 90 people in the classroom, and it's a kind of a U-shaped amphitheater style. And I would have said before I was at business school that it's not possible for 90 people to have a conversation. But it turns out when they are led by a great professor, it is possible for 90 people to have a conversation and to really learn from one another. So overall, I like the case method, and I did learn a lot from it. Although I'm not going to say it's the only way for an adult to learn.
Yeah. That's a very strong statement. And, one of the things among many, the method really requires you to be prepared because, one of the things that might happen is you might get cold called where you're asked something out of the blue. And so you really need to prepare. But there's also a lot of information that goes into cases that might be extraneous. And Kim, one of your favorite quotes, separating the wheat from the chaff, right, is how to know what's an important piece of data or what's not. And folks are really put in the perspective of the protagonist. And so I do believe, Kim, you've been...
Can I interrupt you? Sorry.
Please.
You don't really need to be prepared for all those of you who are going to business school.
This is the difference. I actually prepared for this conversation and Kim did not prepare. So some of us feel like we actually need to be prepared, and some of the bloviating BSers can just
wheedle all on along. I mean, so I have and this is one of the things that I really learned at business school that was useful.
So maybe you don't need to contemplate.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it is important to read and be in the details in a lot of situations. But there are also often situations in life where you walk into a situation and you're trying to figure out what in the world is going on, and you don't really know. And one of the things that HBS taught me to do was to deal with those situations. And the best thing to do in that situation that I learned was, first of all, cross your fingers that you don't get cold called if you haven't read the case. But, there's a 1 in 9, there's only a 1 in 90 chance that you will be cold called. So the odds are in your favor that you won't be put on the spot. And then listen intently to what everyone is saying. And within 15 or 20 minutes, you begin to have an idea of what the deal is.
I'm reminded of a meme on social media of I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. There's a dog with headphones and it's like they're on a call and they say, let's say the dog's name is Lato, because that's the name of the font I'm looking at. Lato, what do you think about that? And then all of a sudden this like game show music is coming in because Lato's like, no idea what they're talking about. Like, how do I answer that question? So listening is important, paying attention. And you also talked about just that confidence of having an opinion and sharing your perspective. And I think you were relatively recently back at HBS and sitting in on some classes. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. And there was a really interesting case that I sat in on, which maybe you and I can describe for folks.
Yeah. Do you want to start, or do you want me to? Where do you want to go?
I'll start. So
okay, don't cold call. I'm not ready for a cold call.
I'm not going to cold call. I'm not going to cold call you. So this was a case. It was focused on this Silicon Valley startup, and 5 of its 35 employees have recently resigned, like in the last couple of months. In this case, and the question is, is this natural attrition for a high-tech startup? And did they need to worry about it and ask these people what was going on and consider some changes? Or were these resignations just, kind of what happens?
Yeah. And I think just to explain not only this case, but how these cases happen, part of what you want to do, especially having spent a year putting some of these cases together, was you might interview people involved with the company. You're going to pull together some demographics, some revenue numbers. And so, for example, in this specific example, the case gives the company's history, sort of their origin, their business model, their organizational structure, like you might see an org chart. They go into detail in HR policies, because the question that they're really trying to look at is this a typical attrition, or is there some larger problem about the culture? But they also shared first-person accounts from those employees who resigned. And then, the ultimate question is, do the co-founders need to do anything to address the issue? So not only do you have the case kind of painting the picture, again, this is set in 2012, but they also have a bunch of exhibits, and part of your job is sort of to figure out, is this relevant or not? Going into detail about like the business model, et cetera. Kim, I don't know if you remember from that conversation, any of the key things that came up in that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, so I think some of the key facts were, and I was not supposed to be piping in, so I was screaming in my head as I was listening to these facts being laid on the table. But like one of the facts laid on the table was, this is a flat organization. There's no HR. There's no policies. When somebody gets promoted, they get promoted willy-nilly. When they get a raise, they get a raise because they did something awesome, and that's the way we like it, kind of like we're working all the time, and
how
that's
do you spell
awesome.
that? Like,
there was a certain amount of bravado that was kind of, dare I say, bloviation. I'm guilty of, like, I'm I don't want to point fingers at a glass house, but there was a certain amount of, we are working all the time and we're proud of it, and we don't have any kind of management and we're proud of it. And
there may have been some quote, I think, where, I don't have any friends and I don't have any time on the weekend, and I think that's great. God.
Yeah, there was the whole idea, and this happens with some frequency in Silicon Valley. Like, they just laugh at work, work-life balance is for the weak, kind of attitude. And that was why these five of the 35 people had quit. They're like, actually, we don't want to work 80 hours a week, 100 hours a week. Like, we're going to do great work. We have done great work, but that's not sustainable way for us to work.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall where the group landed? I mean, part of your role as a student there is to say, hey, I think the co-founder should do this, or I think the co-founder should do that. Like, do you have a sense of where the conversation landed?
Yeah, I think that most of the students were kind of sympathetic with the people who quit and why they quit. And most of the students were kind of like, this doesn't seem like a great culture. Like, we're not sure we would want to work there. That was kind of where the students came out, but where the professor came out was quite different. The professor was like,
can we insert some really dramatic music there, Nick?
Yeah.
Of where
the professor was like, what's wrong with you all? This was a culture. This was like a culture where people were working hard, and if people didn't want to work that hard, they should have left. Was kind of where the professor came down, which was like, it was very hard for me. As you can imagine, at this point, I'm sitting on my hands and biting my cheeks, not to scream.
And just to be clear, like, in terms of painting a picture of the culture, so it's this very sort of work hard, and if you don't want to be part of it, go ahead, the door is that way. And what about the flat part? Like, tell me more about your take on that.
Yeah, so my take, and this goes back to something someone told my husband, Andy, when he moved to Silicon Valley and became a manager for the first time and was really kind of struggling with it. And someone from a law firm that specialized in helping Silicon Valley companies, fast-growing companies, said, in Silicon Valley, management is neither taught nor valued. And that was very much the ethos of this case. Like, the reason why they had a flat structure was that they just, it is easier if you are starting a company and you don't want to spend the time to think through, like, what is the kind of culture we want to create? What's the kind of workplace we want to create? How do we HR issues take time to think through. And it takes more time in the end not to think them through because the wheels come off the bus. But very often there's this notion like, all that stuff is a waste of time. All we need to do is work hard and you'll get paid what I feel like paying you, and don't bother me with trying to, come up with a coherent pay system that is fair to everyone. So that was kind of the ethos.
Yeah.
Of
and
the
I
case.
wonder, like, we've talked about this a bit in other episodes, but the majority of the employees were were engineers, right? So there were other functions that weren't necessarily represented, at least at that point in the company's history.
Yeah, which is fine. I mean, that's normal for a startup, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I mean, I also started a tech company and didn't have any HR people at 65 people, but we did, as a leadership team, sit down and think through, well, we should have performance reviews. We should make sure that we don't promote people willy-nilly, that there's sort of a process. And I would say, even at my startup, I failed to do as good a job as I later learned that I should have done. Like, when I got to Google and Shona Brown was leading business operations, which included HR there, I learned a lot about how to help people work together well in big groups, because if you don't create some structure and some rules, once you get over about 50 people, 40 people, what happens is a lot of bullying tends to sort of replace hierarchy, I think. And if you don't have any, and so what you want to do is you want to create process that doesn't feel like process. You want to make sure that there are rules of hierarchy that don't that that where you're consciously designing them so you don't wind up with toxic practices, which are kind of the natural human beings being who we are. And I mean, I have made these mistakes myself. It's not like if you hire good people, this won't happen. If you hire 65 good people and you expect them to collaborate, and you don't have any and you don't spend any time thinking about what your management processes are, you will get bad behavior, even from good people. It's just inevitable, I think, unfortunately.
It's so interesting. I don't know, I had like a visual of like Lord of the Flies coming in, but just sort of like at some point there's a number. So just to go back to the case, you mentioned that the professor really had a strong encouragement to really actually advocate for the company not to worry about those 5 people leaving, and they had a clear culture and things were going to work out. And I guess in your own words, how would you, just to summarize, where the class landed from the professor's perspective?
I think that, I mean, I assume, I haven't read the teaching note, but I assume the teaching note was like, that, you're trying to push people towards recognizing that when you have a super intense culture and a flat hierarchical organization, it's almost like a Darwinist survival of the fittest kind of environment, and that's just the way it is. And I think that that's exactly the wrong lesson to draw from this. I think that that's wrong. I don't think it is. I don't often a flat when entrepreneurs brag about a flat organization, that what they're often saying is, I have given no thought to how to make sure that my hierarchy doesn't become either chaotic so that it's kind of nasty, brutish, and short, and the biggest bullies are winning, or overly bureaucratic. I mean, you don't. Neither one of those things are good. You don't want chaos and anarchy, and you don't want a totalitarian regime. To go back to your Soviet
I was saying that.
case. Yeah, that was my lesson. That was what I learned in Russia. Actually, in a nutshell, is that totalitarian regimes are terrible, but so is chaos, because in chaos, who wins? The biggest bully. So both of those things are bad.
Well, it's interesting, with the hindsight being 2020, and the case itself was set in 2012. It was updated in 2017. You sat in on the case in 2023. If I'm hearing that right.
So maybe 2022. My pea brain. Can you remember what happens year anymore?
No, that's why I just go to my photos and see what day that was. It's how I outsource my memory. So interestingly, the case was updated in 2017. This company, this little company of 35 less 5, went public in 2019. It's now a company somewhere around $1.2, $1.3 billion revenue. So that's been some sort of a trajectory there.
Can I just interject?
Yeah.
Like everybody gets excited about the number billion. And who knows? Maybe we don't know whether that is a success or a failure. Maybe they should have been a $30 billion company. I don't know. Like maybe if they were better run, they would be $30 billion and not a measly old 1.3 billion. Or maybe it's a wild success. Who knows? It's the measurement problem. Who knows?
Yes, as I often like to say, there's a lovely book called The Measurement Problem. They were named a top 100 most loved workplace in 2023, and have been all over social media in 2024. We're recording this the end of January 2024.
All right. So who's the company? Who's the company?
Drum roll, please.
Who's
We're getting
the company?
Kim,
Sound effects from me.
Yeah. Thanks. You've really got another career there, possibly, with that audio engineering. Look out, Nick. She's after you. So you may have seen a woman named Brittany Peach, who recorded her being laid off by ... Cloudflare. And this was at the start of 2024. Kim, do you want to kind of set the stage of what's happening in this video?
Yeah, I'll start, and then
Okay.
you will tell me where I am missing out on some of the drama. First of all, I want to say that one of the things that I think will help hold sort of companies accountable, managers accountable, is the ability to record interactions. And, it's interesting, like there were all these, when flip phones started being able to record, there were all these like nonprofits, this is gonna end, like all these terrible experiences that people have in tyrannies. But I think it also will help us hold companies accountable. So this Brittany, I guess she probably had a sense she was about to get laid off because a couple of other people were getting laid off. And so she recorded the conversation and she asked some very pointed, direct questions. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed by her ability to just keep asking the questions. But Amy, what did you think? I imagine most people who are listening to this podcast watched this.
Yeah,
So
that's our assumption. We're not gonna play it for you. We'll definitely put it in the show notes if you haven't seen it. And in fact, I think the first way that we heard about it, Brandy, correct me if I'm wrong, that somebody tweeted at us that this was a Radical Candor fail, because this conversation that Brittany recorded, and to your point, Kim, yes, she had, her colleagues were starting to get like these 15-minute conversations popping up, and her sort of work BFF had just said, so she knew at the top what was happening, but what she didn't know was who these two people were on the phone, on the Zoom call, they were someone from HR and someone who was a director who she didn't know. So one of the fails was, where's her manager in all of this?
Yeah. I mean, I would assert, and I know that a lot of companies have not done this recently, but I would assert that if people are going to be fired or laid off, their individual manager should have that conversation with them. And to be fair to Cloudflare, like they are not the only company that has made this mistake. I think not in the most recent Google layoff, but in the previous one, they people just got emails and their managers were actually told they couldn't talk to them. So there's a lot of companies, even great companies that I love, that have done this wrong recently. But who am I to say it's wrong? But it's my opinion, my very strong opinion that a strong opinion's loosely held. I'm open to others, so let me know. Write us if you think I'm wrong. But I think it's really important that a person's individual manager have this conversation with them, because it is like, it's very personal, and firing someone with compassion makes a big difference than just firing them in this sort of very anonymous way. And also, I think sometimes when I've said this, the most common argument on the other side is, well, our managers are terrible, and so we don't trust our managers to have these conversations. And well, okay, that's a whole other problem. You better start teaching your managers how to do this, and how to do this with compassion.
So well said. One thing I want to be clear, and Brandy mentioned, and we can put some more information in the show notes, just this idea of actually recording a call, and just different states, it seems like, have different rules and laws around consent in terms of calls being recorded. Because I did go down a bit of a rabbit hole with a lot of different comments about the recording, and based on where this person is, and is this legal, and is this not legal. One of the other things that I saw
and it was legal. Brittany was in a state where it was legal for one person to record a phone call. And by the way, I think I don't know much about the law, but here's a question.
Can we get that on repeat?
I don't know much about the law.
But I'm
just the daughter of a lawyer. But I think that I suspect it's okay. Check me. Talk to your lawyer.
Jason, can you hear us, Jason?
This is not legal advice. but I suspect it's okay to record it. It's just not okay to share that recording.
Interesting
guess.
distinction. That feels very legal with the parsing.
Yes,
as well.
Yes, well, maybe
good parsing.
Maybe I missed my calling.
You did miss your calling. I, of course,
anyway.
Took the LSATs. There were.
I took the LSATs too. I did, and that told me that was not my calling. I got a clear answer. I got some radical candor.
Well,
don't go to law school, Kim.
I don't know much about the law. So one of the things in the comments was like, basically, would you prefer a mass firing, like, or just a shitty one-on-one conversation? And so that was interesting because, like, there were definitely people that felt like, you know what, let's just do it like in this big mass Zoom meeting rather than like this terrible conversation that actually happened. So I'm just like sort of throwing it out there. If you're not able to have the ideal version where, I mean, maybe the manager was gone too. And, if you're choosing between two people who don't know this person and can't say anything versus just like one large conversation, what do you think about that?
Well, so it's hard to answer that question exactly because we haven't gotten to all the problems that, HR was sort of telling her that she was being fired because she had not performed well.
That's right.
When in fact, it seems like what was happening was a layoff. And so I would prefer to be laid off than fired because of something. I think I'd rather be laid off and be able to blame my manager or the management, the leadership of the company for having overhired than I would be being fired because I made a mistake.
That's right. And actually, she did really well on that, right? So
that was part of what made the video so compelling.
It's so compelling because this director says, they're parting ways with her. She didn't meet her 2023 performance goals. And she's like, now, wait a minute. I'm just going to pause you right there. And I thought that was a really effective way of saying, hey, I've been here for 3 months. This is what I've done. It was over this holiday. It was over that holiday, et cetera. So I think she really advocated for herself. And it really, I think, showed that what they were trying to sort of attribute to performance was really potentially more to some sort of overhiring. And it was hard for them to give the details about the specific metrics that she wasn't hitting.
Yeah. Although there's some questions about that. I think we'll read what the CEO said later. So I'm not sure. So one question is, if you're going to do a layoff, it's not about people's performance. And it seemed from what HR was saying that this was a layoff, not actually. But then it seems like from what the CEO said that she was actually being fired for performance. So it's not clear.
Yeah.
So I think one thing that should be made clear is what's the deal? Is this a layoff or am I being fired as a result of my performance? And if I'm being fired as a result of my performance, I definitely want my manager there to explain, to tell me. Because I want to be able to look my manager in the eye and say, this is the first I'm hearing of this, if that's the case. So that's one thing.
I think that's that's a really big point, Kim, because I feel like that would have been a very different conversation because she kept asking them, like, show me where I've missed it or what the number. Oh, we can't say it. We can't say it. We can't say, so
So I think if I'm being fired because I have missed my numbers or I've done something wrong, then I definitely want to have a conversation with my manager, even if my manager is not good at having that conversation. But I think also if I'm being laid off, I would also rather be told by my manager than by someone else. Because I think that if I'm being laid off and if I have a good manager that second if may be a big if, but if I'm being laid off and if I have a good manager, I know that manager cares about me and I know that manager might be able to say something that would help me feel better. That manager may also be able to introduce me to someone that might help me get my next job. And I think that that's like part of the job of being a manager is to provide that kind of care for people. And so I think either way, now I think the question that was asked is kind of a false dichotomy. Like, would I rather be fired in an anonymous way in a mass Zoom call? Or would I rather be fired in an obnoxious way, specifically directed at me by a terrible manager? Well, maybe I would rather have the anonymous Zoom
Are these
call,
really the only choices?
Those are pretty bad. Those are pretty bad choices.
Yeah. And I just want to reiterate what you said about really like that personal connection, that sense of a path forward. And Kim, in Radical Candor, you have some really great stories just from your own experience of how, it's such a difficult thing to fire people and yet giving people a path forward. So I just want to acknowledge that we did dedicate a podcast episode to the emotional toll of being laid off. We shared our own experiences. So I encourage folks to listen to that. And in the video, I think, it's very poignant, obviously, feeling the connection to Brittany and, how she's managing that call and how two people who don't know her are, trying to give support and just that big disconnect there. So we're not going to spend a lot of time here on that, but I want to acknowledge what a big, piece that is.
Yeah. And I also think like, I do have some compassion for these two people from HR because if they were told to do this, like they're being put in a situation that is almost inevitably manipulatively insincere, because they don't know her at all. And they're delivering this terrible news to her. And yes, you can be compassionate with someone you don't know at all, but, and maybe they're afraid for their jobs. Like in an ideal world, they would have raised their hand and said, no, I won't do this because it's the wrong way to handle it. But they seemed like they weren't especially, they hadn't had a lot of education on what the right way to do this is either. One of the dangers, they were perhaps, suffering from a flat organization that had not given much thought to how to structure the rules of a hierarchy so that it would neither be totalitarian nor nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah, that was, one of the things when I was going down the rabbit hole of different comments was, oftentimes, and I'm curious, Kim, from your own experience, like people in those roles might get a list of, here's hundreds of people, like here's the list, go now do it and tell them. I don't know if you've ever been directly involved in a situation with such a large number of people like that, like the people, this was, I think, a smaller version, but.
I think I've told this story before, but it's worth repeating. Early in my career, I joined a startup and they did a layoff and they hired kind of the person who I described as a paid asshole to come in and to do the firing and to have the conversations. And he didn't know the people at all. And in fact, he knew so little that he made the following mistake. After he had fired like half the company, he called a meeting of the people who were still there, but some of the people who had been fired were still in the building. And so they got swept into this meeting that he summonsed everyone to, where he told them all to look more cheerful and we had this great future ahead. And it was just, it was awful. And it was that moment where I realized, there is a kind and good way. There like these decisions, sometimes layoffs are necessary from a business perspective, but there is a way to do it that leaves people with their dignity intact, and that also is not dishonest, and that really matters.
It's such a great point. And I actually want to get into that in just a moment. Before we wrap up on this call that was recorded, one of the things, just this whole idea of like performance-based and not a layoff. And I know that we got into this in previous conversations, but Kim, just to speak to that, there's like an actual legal justification of why somebody might want to be clear versus, performance versus layoff in terms of severance or other obligations. Do you have a perspective on that?
I do. I'm not sure what the rules are anymore, so you should consult your local HR person. But I think, at a high level, when you're doing a layoff, it's because it's a cost-cutting measure, and it doesn't reflect on the performance of the people who are affected. Usually, you decide that we're gonna, cut a whole department, or we're gonna cut across the board, and that's where you get into kind of a gray area. Because if you're just gonna cut, 10% of all employees, then I think you're probably not gonna cut your top performers. And so that's where there is, to be fair, a bit of a gray area. But I think in terms of performance management, if you say we're gonna cut 10% of our low performers, then you're firing people for being in the bottom 10%. And then you have to explain to them, you have to give them an opportunity to improve, so it shouldn't be a surprise that they're in the bottom 10%. That should be a stated policy, like, this is what we do at this company. And that, by the way, that firing the bottom 10% often gets so political so quickly, and people game that like you wouldn't even believe. So it's not necessarily something I agree with doing. But what I do agree with doing is identifying the people on your team who are not doing a good job and who are not likely to get better. You're not doing them any favors to keep them around, and you're hurting the whole team.
It's so interesting, just to go back to the measurement problem. So in this specific case, she was on the sales team and only there for 3 months. And so when you think about the measurement problem, that sales might have some, very like specific goals and actual like ways to measure success. Do you feel like this situation is any different because of the more quantifiable nature of sales, or is this sort of across the board challenges that you see?
Well, I mean, I don't. I think very often the metrics are not crystal clear, and there is some subjective judgment, and those should be shared with people very clearly early on. Like, I would imagine that if they are reducing the size of their sales team, that may have something to do with the fact that sales aren't going as well as they had hoped. Or it may have to do with just being very rigorous about identifying people who are not performing well on the sales team. And sometimes those people are not performing well because they're not selling enough. But other times the problem may be that they're not good team players, that they're bullying other people on their teams. And that's the reason why a salesperson might be fired. But in either case, they should be given, they should know before they're being fired that there's a problem. 3 months seems like a short amount of time, but sometimes within. I mean, the CEO said this. I think we're gonna
let's get into that.
We can read his note. Sometimes and sometimes you take a job. Like, I took a job once and I realized 2 months in that I had made a big mistake and I quit. And so often you do know when there's a problem, and pretty fast. And there's no reason to wait longer than you need to, but you should talk to the person.
I mean, clearly in this case, it seemed like there was totally caught off guard. So so speaking of that, let's get into, so on January 11th, 2024, CEO of Cloudflare, Matthew Prince, responded. And I thought what I would do, Kim, is go through, and I think this was on X/Twitter, go through some of the sentences and just kind of get your take on this response, because I think there's some insights you have to share. So Matthew Prince says, "We fired about 40 salespeople out of over 1,500 in our go-to market org. That's a normal quarter." Do you think that's it's just under 3% in a quarter? Like, how do you feel about that as a number?
I mean, it's in the absence of other factors, it's hard to answer that. It feels like a lot to me, but I think that, again, there are organizations that that are pretty aggressive about firing people when they're not hitting their metrics or when they are not behaving in a way that has been defined as acceptable, like if they're bullying people. And, that seems like a lot. I wouldn't say I look at that number and I know it's wrong. I don't, I don't really know.
So he goes on, he says, when we're doing performance management right, we can often tell within 3 months or less of a sales hire, even during the holidays, whether they're going to be successful or not. Sadly, we don't hire perfectly.
I think that is a reasonable statement. At the same time, if you can tell within 3 months, you should be talking to the person within 1 month. And so,
well, this is a good segue into our next piece. So,
yes,
quote, we try to fire perfectly. In this case, clearly we are far from perfect. The video is painful for me to watch. Managers
can we stop right there? Can we?
Okay.
I know there's more, and I want you to read more. But this guy is acting as though it's painful for me to watch, like as though he has nothing to do with it. Like there's he's not taking any personal accountability or saying the buck stops with me or here's what I'm going to do to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. He's like, boo hoo, it's painful for me to watch. Like, boo fucking who? That's what I say to you. Anyway, please continue.
Oh, I'm so glad you interrupted me. We have so many new potential titles for this episode. I think boo fucking who is getting up there. He goes on, managers should always be involved. Then he says HR should be involved, but it shouldn't be outsourced to them.
Yes.
Managers should always be involved.
Like, he's acting as though he has nothing to, like, this is my advice to some other organization.
Gambling in Casablanca.
Not the organization that I founded and I'm the CEO of. I mean, yes, I agree. Managers should always be involved. The question is, why weren't they in this case? And he doesn't, well, keep reading. Maybe he does.
HR should be involved, but it shouldn't be outsourced to them. No employee should ever actually be surprised they weren't performing. We don't always get it right.
That is not an acceptable apology, I would say. And it's not an apology at all. I mean, I think all of those statements are true, and they sure didn't get it right. But he's not taking any sort of accountability here for the fact that his company didn't get this right. He's not saying he's sorry in any way, shape, or form. It's not an apology. But I think if we go back to one of my favorite books of all time, Danya Ruttenberg's On Repentance and Repair, like you have to acknowledge what you did wrong. You have to hold yourself accountable. Like you have to accept the consequences for you, make amends to this other person. Those are the things you have to do before you get to an apology. And he sort of says, well, the implication of this is like, if I know what was wrong, then I'm off the hook and I'm not letting him off the hook.
In some way, it sounds like what you're saying is like awareness and acknowledgement is like, that's fine, but what are you actually doing about it? And how are you actually kind of showing?
Yeah.
Showing, not telling.
Like he could say, we owe this person more severance because we didn't tell her. Maybe there's also maybe stuff, I don't know. Maybe they did tell her and she is an excellent actor. Like, I don't know. But what he said here is not holding himself accountable and not making sure that it's not going to happen again.
Okay. So this one I thought was very interesting especially from a radical candor perspective and also from an accountability perspective. And sometimes underperforming employees don't actually listen to the feedback they've gotten before we let them go.
Yes, that happens. Also, true statement.
Yeah.
But now he's sort of implying that she got the feedback and she didn't listen to it. Like what he could have said instead is, I am gonna look into why this was handled the way it was, and to make sure that going forward, no one at this company will ever be fired by someone they don't know, and will not be surprised that there will have been many conversations and documentation before we get to the point of firing. Because the problem with this is if I'm working at the company, now I'm like, oh gosh, maybe someone told me feedback in such coded language that I didn't understand the feedback, and maybe I'm going to get fired next. And I don't have any sense that I'm not going to be treated the same way she was treated.
Well said. So we're going to shift into a lot of what you talk about of really, there's no like there's always a great job somebody can find. So he goes on and says, importantly, just because we fire someone doesn't mean they're a bad employee. Doesn't mean they won't be really, really great somewhere else. Chris Paul was a bad fit for the Suns, but he's undoubtedly a great basketball player. And in fact, we think the right thing to do is get people we know are unlikely to succeed off the team as quickly as possible so they can find the right place for them. You talk about this a lot.
Yeah, no, that was a good thing. I think this was the best thing that he said. I think that is very well said.
How do you feel about the basketball reference? You're okay with that?
You know me. I don't really get sports.
You love basketball. I know you.
I don't really get sports, but I'm fine. I don't have to get sports to understand the analogy.
Yeah.
I'm fine with the analogy.
Yeah, I thought this part would resonate with you. So he closes by saying, and in fact, we think the right thing to do is get people we know are unlikely to succeed off the team as quickly as possible so they can find the right place for them. We definitely weren't anywhere close to perfect in this case, but any healthy org needs to get the people who aren't performing off. That wasn't the mistake here. The mistake was not being more kind and humane as we did. And that's something, and then he added, I think is it the COO, the co-founder?
His co-founder, yeah.
His co-founder and I are focused on improving going forward.
I think that I agree. There's no reason once you know that it's not working, you're better. There's no reason to let it linger forever. And so I do think the mistake was it wasn't only not being more kind and humane. It seemed like the mistake, more explicitly, was not having their manager talk to them and making sure they weren't surprised. And I think he could have improved that a bit by saying, I want to ensure each and every person working here that they will not be surprised if they get fired. That they will be given the feedback in a very clear way and an opportunity to address it.
Well said. I'm going to cold call you on this one, Kim.
Okay.
How would you like to make an offer to Cloudflare or to Matthew Prince for some coaching?
Sure. I mean, I'm always happy to speak with people. I imagine he's not going to want to take me up on that offer, but I'd be happy to. In fact, I've worked with this company. I've given a Radical Candor talk there, or maybe I was on a podcast. Podcast. I think that this company is doing interesting work. I like the people, but this was a miss.
All right. Well, anything else before we get into our checklist?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge, I feel a little bit like I'm criticizing in public here, which is breaking my own rule. I feel like, though, if we're not able to talk about these kinds of management mistakes publicly, that it's very hard to move forward. So I feel like if you are a senior leader somewhere, you're kind of the exception to the criticize in private rule.
That's such an interesting point on that. And obviously this conversation has been unfolding in public. And I think it also just going back to the case of, building a culture where you do have some of these processes, and absent them, what you end up then having to have these conversations in public at some point. But I think it's a really important point. And
I think sorry, I'm interrupting again. One of the things that I wonder if you heard this at HBS, but one of the things they used to tell us, this is like maybe the lowest bar ever for asking yourself the moral questions. But one of the things that used to get said is if you don't want to read about it in the Wall Street Journal, don't do it, don't say it. And
yes, that was one of my and I think we talked about one of my favorite professors, Joe Bottaraco, and his course on, I think, using literature as a way to reflect on moral inquiry. But it's like, you want this on 60 Minutes?
Yeah. So that's I think when you become a leader, like there was one friend of mine who was a sort of public leader, and she complained to me that she said, a lot of people make mistakes, but not everybody has to read about them in the Wall Street Journal every time they screw up. And so I do want to extend some compassion for these leaders. Like that is hard. But at the same time, it comes with the territory of being a leader.
Yeah, I think it's such a great point because especially now, with cameras and video, like you are on 24/7, and there's not a lot of room for mistakes. And so, we've talked about this on the podcast, but kind of having the capacity to talk about mistakes, again, using kind and clear criticism, not criticizing the person, but the way in which they could have done it better, or how the organization, in terms of their processes. Do you have we talk so much about criticism being person to person. Is there a way to kind of criticize an organizational culture without, quote, personalizing it?
Yeah, I mean, we could have decided not to name the company, but I think given that this is already talked about so much, I don't think we're making their lives any worse. I also feel a little bit like once you become the leader of a publicly traded company, it's a publicly traded company. Like you are now a case study, like it or not. And so I think it's fair game.
All right. Well, thank you for bringing that in for this conversation. And we're going to get into our radical candor checklist.
All right. Tip number 1, don't get so caught up in all the HR legal advice that you fail to act like a human being. Words of wisdom from a great leader is remember when you're getting advice from legal or HR, they are your navigator, but you are driving the bus. So take a deep breath. Don't let someone else drive your vehicle. Drive your own vehicle. Take a deep breath and take a big step back. You, as the manager, you're the person who has a relationship with the employee who's about to get fired. You still need to give a damn about this person. You need to think hard about how to do it in a way that will make it easiest on them, even if it makes it harder on you, or if you have to take some risks. Don't outsource firing people.
Tip number 2, identify problems early and be clear about naming those problems and what the expectations are. What does good look like so that the person has time to address them? This reduces the shock if they can't or won't address it, and you do end up having to fire the person. When you're giving somebody a good or even a great performance review rating one quarter, you fire them the next, it undermines trust, and it also opens you up to potential legal liability. Again, this is not a legal podcast.
Tip number 3, when you have to fire people, do it with humility. Remember, the reason you have to fire them is not that they suck. It's not even that they suck at this job. It's not even that the job sucks. It's that the job you gave them sucks for them. So something sucks, but it's very important to be clear. And it's not that other person. And it's not you, and it's not the job. It's just this job sucks for them. Think about the job that they would be great at. And to end on giving a little bit of praise for the CEO, I think he did say that pretty well.
Yeah.
When he was in his basketball analogy.
And building on that, we'll add a 4th tip of criticizing in private, and when you are in the C-suite, in that leadership role, especially in a public company, being aware that as you make mistakes, how you handle them will be watched. And Kim is happy to help as available. And again, thank you to Brittany for modeling, how to respond in such a difficult situation, and for the conversation that has since sparked. For more tips, go to radicalcandor.com/resources. Among other things, you can download our free learning guides. And we encourage you to go ahead and register for our workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop. Show notes for this episode you can find at radicalcandor.com/podcast. And like we've been talking about, praise in public and private, criticize in private, I guess with the coda if you are a CEO of a publicly traded company. So if you like what you hear, go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you hear your podcasts. And if you've got criticism for us, email it podcast@radicalcandor.com. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.